The piercing crack of a wooden axle giving way echoed through the vast Wyoming prairie, drowning out Katherine Coleman's desperate pleas as her husband mounted his horse without a backward glance. The spring of 1878 seemed determined to break not just her wagon but her spirit as well. "Stuart, you cannot leave us here," Katherine cried, her voice carrying across the windswept plains. Her auburn hair, once neatly pinned, now whipped wildly around her face. "What about your son? What about your promises?" 4-year-old Thomas clung to her skirts, blue eyes wide with confusion as his father adjusted his hat, expression hardened like the parched earth beneath them. "I've made my choice, Kat," Stuart said, the nickname she once loved now bitter on his lips. "California's gold won't wait forever. That wagon's done for, and I won't be dragging a woman and child through Indian territory when I could move twice as fast alone." "We have a life in Montana waiting for us," Katherine protested, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. "Your brother is expecting us all in Helena." Stuart's eyes, once warm with affection, now regarded her with cold detachment. "Tell James I'll write when I've made my fortune." With that final betrayal, he dug his heels into his horse's flanks and galloped west, becoming smaller against the setting sun until he was nothing more than a speck on the horizon. Katherine stood frozen beside the broken wagon, one wheel tilted at an impossible angle, the wooden axle splintered beyond her ability to repair. Their worldly possessions, clothes, kitchenware, family heirlooms, and dwindling supplies lay packed inside the canvas-covered frame, suddenly as immobile as her shattered dreams. "Mama," Thomas tugged at her dress, "when's Papa coming back?" She knelt down, brushing a smudge of dirt from her son's cheek. "I don't know, darling." The truth burned in her throat. Stuart wasn't coming back. After 7 years of marriage, he had abandoned them on the lonely trail between Cheyenne and the Montana Territory, leaving them with little food, less water, and a broken wagon 20 miles from the nearest settlement. As the reality of their situation sank in, Katherine's momentary despair hardened into determination. They had camped near a small creek, at least ensuring water for the night. Their 2 oxen grazed contentedly, unaware of the disaster that had befallen their human companions. "We'll make a fine camp tonight," she told Thomas with forced cheerfulness. "And tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." That night, after tucking Thomas into their bedroll beneath the wagon's canvas, Katherine sat beside their small fire, reviewing their provisions. They had food for perhaps 5 days if strictly rationed, ammunition for Stuart's rifle that he'd surprisingly left behind, and the clothes on their backs. The spring night carried a chill that matched the cold, not of fear, in her stomach. The distant howl of wolves made her clutch the rifle tighter. She'd used it before Stuart had insisted she learn to shoot, but she'd never had to rely on it as their only protection. Katherine stared into the darkness, wondering how she would defend her son, repair their wagon, and continue their journey alone. Morning brought no solutions, only the harsh reality of their abandonment made clearer in daylight. Katherine examined the broken axle again, running her fingers along the splintered wood. The heavy wagon had come down hard when the wheel struck a deep rut, snapping the axle clean through. Even if she possessed the knowledge to repair it, she lacked the strength and tools. "Breakfast, Mama?" Thomas asked, emerging from the wagon, his hair tousled from sleep. Katherine managed a smile. "Yes, of course. We'll have a bit of jerky and some hardtack." As she prepared their meager meal, Katherine's mind raced. They could wait here, hoping another wagon train or traveler might pass by, but spring travelers were uncommon on this particular stretch. They could attempt to walk to the nearest settlement, but 20 miles with a young child and only what they could carry seemed nearly impossible. Her desperate calculations were interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Katherine grabbed the rifle, positioning herself between the approaching rider and Thomas. "Stay behind me," she whispered to her son, her heart hammering as she raised the rifle to her shoulder. The rider appeared over the rise, slowing his horse as he spotted their camp. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A single horse followed behind, tied to his saddle. "Hello, the camp," the stranger called, stopping his horse at a respectful distance. "Mind if I approach?" Katherine kept the rifle steady. "State your business, sir." The man raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Name's Nathaniel James. I'm heading north to Montana Territory. Spotted your camp smoke and thought I'd check if everything's all right." His voice carried a gentle southern drawl that somehow softened his imposing figure. "We're fine," Katherine replied automatically, though the broken wagon behind her told a different story. Nathaniel's eyes, a striking green that stood out against his sun-darkened skin, took in the scene: the listing wagon, the solitary woman with a rifle, the small boy peering around her skirts. "Seems like you've had some trouble with your axle, madam," he observed, nodding toward the wagon. "Mind if I take a look? I've fixed a few in my time." Katherine hesitated. Stuart's warnings about strangers on the trail echoed in her mind, but the man who had issued those warnings had abandoned them to their fate. What choice did she have? "You may approach," she said, lowering the rifle slightly but keeping it ready. "But slowly, if you please." Nathaniel dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He moved toward them with deliberate steps, his hands still visible. As he came closer, Katherine could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome, with laugh lines around his eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. "I mean no harm to you or your boy," he said softly. "Just offering assistance to fellow travelers." Thomas, ever curious, stepped from behind Katherine. "Our wagon broke. Papa left to find gold." Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks as Nathaniel's gaze met hers, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Thomas," she admonished gently, "let me speak with the gentleman." Nathaniel knelt to Thomas's level. "Well, young man, wagon axles are tricky things. Would you mind if I take a look at yours?" Thomas nodded eagerly, his wariness of strangers forgotten in the excitement of a visitor. Katherine watched carefully as Nathaniel moved to inspect the broken axle, setting his hat aside to reveal thick dark hair tied back at his neck. "This is a clean break," he observed, running his hands over the splintered wood. "I've got some tools that might help. With your permission, madam." Katherine nodded, still wary but desperate for any solution. "My name is Katherine Coleman. This is my son, Thomas. Pleased to meet you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Nathaniel retrieved tools from his saddlebags and set to work examining the damage more thoroughly. Over the next hour, Katherine watched as Nathaniel assessed the broken axle with practiced hands. He explained that he'd need to fashion a new one from a suitable tree, but with his tools and some effort, he believed he could make the wagon roadworthy again. "It'll take a day, maybe two," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "If you're willing to wait that long." "We have little choice," Katherine replied, offering him water from their canteen. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. James. Call me Nate, please." He took a long drink before continuing. "Your husband, he left recently?" Katherine stiffened. "Yesterday. He decided California's gold was more important than his family's welfare." Nate's expression darkened. "No offense intended, Mrs. Coleman, but that's not the action of a man deserving the title." "None taken," Katherine said quietly. "And please call me Katherine." As the day progressed, Katherine observed Nate's methodical work. He located a suitable ash tree near the creek, cut it down with practiced efficiency, and began the laborious process of shaping a new axle. Thomas followed him like a shadow, fascinated by every swing of the axe and stroke of the drawknife. Katherine busied herself with camp tasks, but found her eyes drawn repeatedly to the stranger who had appeared so providentially. There was something reassuring about his presence, a quiet competence that radiated from him as he worked. By evening, Nate had roughly shaped the new axle but would need another day to finish it properly. As they sat around the campfire after Thomas had fallen asleep, Katherine found herself sharing more than she intended about her circumstances. "Stuart and I married young," she explained, staring into the flames. "He promised we'd build a life in Montana, where his brother has a ranch. But gold fever got the better of him. He's been restless for months, talking of nothing but the California strikes." Nate listened quietly, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "Some men are built for settling, others for searching," he said finally. "Doesn't excuse leaving his family stranded." "Where are you bound?" Katherine asked, curious about the man who had come to their aid. "Helena," Nate replied. "I've spent the last 5 years driving cattle up from Texas, but I'm looking to put down roots. Got a cousin in Helena who says there's good land to be had." "That's our destination as well," Katherine said. "Stuart's brother James has offered us a place until we can establish ourselves." Nate poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. "It's a dangerous stretch of trail for a woman and child alone," he said carefully. "Indian troubles have quieted some, but there are other dangers: rough men, wild animals, the elements themselves." Katherine's chin lifted. "I'm aware of the risks, Mr. James, but I have little choice now." "You might," Nate said, his voice low. "I could ride along with you to Helena. 2 travelers together fare better than 1 alone, especially with a young one in tow." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and laden with implications. Katherine studied him in the flickering light. He seemed honorable, his eyes direct and honest, but she had believed the same of Stuart once. "Why would you delay your journey for strangers?" she asked. Nate's smile was slight but genuine. "My mama raised me to believe helping others was never a delay but a duty. Besides, I'm in no particular hurry. The land will still be there when we arrive." Katherine considered his offer. The prospect of traveling alone with Thomas terrified her more than she cared to admit. Yet accepting help from a man she'd known for less than a day seemed reckless. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition," Nate replied. "Just good sense. Trails safer with companions." He stood, stretching his tall frame. "Think on it overnight. We've got another day of work ahead before any decisions need making." The next morning brought clarity with the dawn. Katherine had slept fitfully, weighing her options and finding them few. When Nate resumed work on the axle, she approached him with her decision. "If your offer still stands, Mr. James, we would welcome your company to Helena." Nate looked up from his work, a smile breaking across his face. "It stands, and I'm glad of it. We'll make better time together." Over the next day, Katherine observed Nate's patient work with growing appreciation. He shaped the new axle with meticulous care, explaining each step to an enthralled Thomas. By midday, he had fitted the replacement axle and was working to reattach the wheel. "You seem quite skilled at this," Katherine remarked, bringing him a cup of coffee. "My father was a wheelwright back in Georgia," Nate explained, accepting the cup gratefully. "I grew up in his shop before the war changed everything." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost him at Antietam when I was 16. Took to the trail after that, working cattle drives, learning to survive." "I'm sorry about your father," Katherine said softly. understanding loss all too well. Her own parents had died of fever when she was 19, leaving her alone until Stuart had come into her life with promises of adventure and security. By late afternoon, the wagon stood repaired, the new axle solid and the wheel firmly attached. Nate tested it, rocking the wagon to ensure it would hold. "It's not pretty," he admitted, "but it'll get you to Helena. We should start at first light tomorrow." That evening, as they prepared for the journey ahead, Katherine felt a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The man sitting across the fire from her was still largely a stranger, yet there was something about his quiet strength that comforted her. "Thomas has taken to you," she observed as her son dozed against Nate's side, exhausted from a day of helping with the wagon repairs. Nate looked down at the sleeping boy, his expression softening. "He's a fine lad. Reminds me of my little brother at that age." He carefully shifted Thomas into Katherine's arms. "Best get some sleep. Trail's long ahead." The journey north began at dawn. Nate rode ahead on his sorrel gelding, scouting the path, while Katherine drove the wagon with Thomas beside her. The broken axle had delayed them, but the weather held fair, and the trail was passable if rough. As days passed, Katherine found herself watching Nate with increasing interest. There was an ease about him on the trail, a natural confidence that came from years of self-reliance. He hunted rabbits and prairie hens to supplement their provisions, taught Thomas to recognize animal tracks, and told stories around the campfire that made her son laugh until his sides ached. More than once, Katherine caught herself wondering what life might have been like had she met Nathaniel James before Stuart Coleman. The thought brought both guilt and a flutter of something she hadn't felt in years. A week into their journey, they made camp near a small tributary of the Powder River. As Katherine prepared supper, Nate took Thomas fishing, returning triumphantly with several trout. "Mama, I caught one myself," Thomas exclaimed, proudly displaying his catch. "Mr. Nate showed me how to be very still and patient," he continued, bouncing with excitement that belied his newly acquired patience. Katherine smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, Thomas, and thank you, Nate. He'll remember this day." Later, after Thomas had fallen asleep in the wagon, Katherine and Nate sat by the fire, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them. "He's a quick learner," Nate commented. "Sharp mind in that boy." "Yes," Katherine agreed. "Stuart never had much time for teaching him things. Always too busy planning our next move." She stared into the flames. "I worry about what this abandonment will do to him as he grows." Nate considered this. "Children are resilient, Katherine, and a boy learns what it is to be a man by the examples set before him." He met her gaze across the fire. "Better he learns early that some promises aren't kept than spend his life believing in falsehoods." His words struck Katherine deeply. Wasn't that precisely what she had done believed in Stuart's promises, despite mounting evidence of his unreliability? "You speak from experience," she observed. Nate nodded slowly. "My mother remarried after my father died, chose poorly. I learned that a man's word is only as good as his actions that follow." The conversation shifted to their plans upon reaching Helena. Katherine explained that Stuart's brother James owned a successful ranch and had offered them a place to stay until they could establish themselves. "And now," Nate asked, "with Stuart gone, will his brother still welcome you?" It was a question Katherine had asked herself repeatedly. "James is a good man, unlike his brother in many ways. He wrote that there would always be a place for us, especially for Thomas. They have no children of their own." "Still," Nate said carefully, "it might be wise to consider other options. Helena's growing fast. A woman of your capabilities could find independence there." His confidence in her abilities warmed Katherine more than the fire before them. Stuart had always emphasized her dependence, treating her competence as a threat rather than an asset. "What of your plans?" she asked. "You mentioned land near Helena. My cousin Patrick has a stake north of town. Says there's adjacent property that would suit me." Nate's expression grew distant. "I've had my fill of wandering. Time to build something lasting." The following days brought them closer to their destination, but also closer as companions. Katherine found herself sharing thoughts she'd kept hidden for years, her dreams of a small homestead, her love of books, her secret hope that Thomas might someday attend university rather than follow the restless path of his father. Nate, in turn, spoke of his years on cattle drives, the majesty of the Texas plains, and his desire to raise horses on land of his own. He described the house he planned to build, solid timber with a wide porch where one could watch the sunset. As they approached the Montana border, the landscape changed, becoming more dramatic with rugged mountains rising in the distance. Their pace slowed as they navigated more difficult terrain, and Katherine found herself grateful for Nate's experienced guidance. One afternoon, as they made their way through a narrow pass, a sudden spring storm caught them unawares. Thunder cracked overhead as rain poured down, turning the trail to mud within minutes. "We need shelter," Nate called over the downpour, pointing to a rocky overhang ahead. Katherine urged the oxen forward, but the wagon wheels sank into the rapidly softening ground. The animals strained, but the wagon remained stubbornly stuck. Nate dismounted in the driving rain, leading his horse to the wagon. "I'll help pull from the front. You keep the oxen moving." Working together in the storm, they managed to free the wagon and guide it to the relative shelter of the overhang. By the time they secured the animals and huddled beneath the rock, all three were soaked to the skin. "You're shivering," Nate observed, concern etching his features as he looked at Katherine and Thomas. "Just need to get dry," Katherine replied through chattering teeth. Nate efficiently gathered what dry wood he could find beneath their shelter and started a small fire, using skills honed through years of outdoor living. He retrieved blankets from his saddlebags, miraculously still dry in their oilskin wrapping. "You should change into dry clothes," he advised, handing the blankets to Katherine. "I'll turn my back." Katherine helped Thomas into dry clothing before changing herself, acutely aware of Nate's presence just feet away, his back resolutely turned. When they were settled, wrapped in blankets near the fire, Nate changed his own shirt, revealing a torso mapped with scars, evidence of a life lived hard on the frontier. Katherine found herself unable to look away until he pulled a dry shirt over his head. When he turned and caught her gaze, a flush heated her cheeks despite the chill in the air. The storm raged through the night, transforming their shelter into an island amid nature's fury. Thomas fell asleep between them, his head resting on Katherine's lap while his feet pressed against Nate's thigh. "He trusts you," Katherine said softly, stroking her son's hair. "He doesn't take to people easily, not since his father started pulling away," Nate finished for her. His eyes, reflecting the firelight, held no judgment, only understanding. "Children sense more than we give them credit for." "Yes," Katherine sighed. "He knew Stuart was leaving before I did, I think. Started clinging to me weeks ago." Nate's hand rested briefly on Thomas's foot, a gesture of such gentle protectiveness that Katherine felt her throat tighten. "He's lucky to have you for his mother." "And I'm fortunate we had you to fix our wagon," Katherine replied. "And more grateful than I can express that you offered to accompany us." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a recognition of how quickly they had come to rely on one another, to find comfort in each other's company. The storm cleared by morning, leaving behind a washed, clean world and more difficult travel conditions. The trail had turned to mud, slowing their progress considerably. What should have been a 2-week journey stretched into 3 as they navigated washed-out paths and swollen streams. During this time, Katherine observed Nate's unflagging patience and resourcefulness. When a wheel stuck, he found a solution. When game was scarce, he somehow managed to provide. When Thomas grew restless from long days in the wagon, Nate invented games to keep him occupied. One evening, as they camped along the Gallatin River with the mountains rising majestically around them, Katherine realized with a start that she had not thought of Stuart in days. Instead, her mind had been filled with Nate, his laugh, his stories, the way his hand occasionally brushed hers as they worked around camp. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. Her marriage had officially ended with Stuart's abandonment, but her heart had begun healing far more quickly than she would have believed possible. "Penny for your thoughts," Nate said, interrupting her reverie as he handed her a cup of coffee. Katherine accepted the cup, their fingers touching briefly. "I was thinking about how different this journey has been from what I expected. For the better, I hope." There was a hesitancy in his question that touched her. "Very much so," she answered honestly. "I dreaded this trip for months before we left Cheyenne. Stuart complained constantly about how slow we'd travel with the wagon, how Thomas would delay us." She shook her head. "Now I find myself almost sorry to see Helena on the horizon." Nate's expression changed subtly. "We should reach town within 2 days," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Have you written ahead to your brother-in-law about Stuart?" "I had no way to send a letter," Katherine replied. "James will be surprised to see us arrive without Stuart, but not, I think, entirely shocked. He knows his brother's nature." Nate nodded, staring into the fire. "And your plans once we reach Helena? Will you stay with James and his wife?" It was the question Katherine had been turning over in her mind for days. "Initially, yes. They've offered us a home for as long as we need. But eventually," she took a deep breath, "eventually I hope to establish some independence, perhaps open a small dressmaking shop. I have some skill with a needle." "I've seen your mending," Nate said with a smile. "You have more than some skill." His compliment warmed her. "What of you? Will you settle on the land your cousin mentioned?" "That's my hope," Nate confirmed. "Patrick says it's good grazing land with a year-round creek and timber for building. If it's as he describes, I'll file my claim straight away." Katherine tried to imagine Nate settled on his own land, building the house he described with its wide porch and solid walls. The image brought an unexpected ache. In 2 days' time, their paths would diverge. He to his land, she to her brother-in-law's ranch. The thought left her feeling hollow. "Helena's not so large a place," Nate said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Our paths need not separate entirely." Before Katherine could respond, Thomas emerged from the wagon where he'd been playing with the carved wooden horse Nate had made him. "Mr. Nate, will you tell me a story about Texas?" he asked, climbing into the man's lap without hesitation. "Well now, let me think," Nate replied, settling the boy comfortably. "Have I told you about the time I had to chase a clever calf through a cactus patch?" As Nate spun his tale, embellishing for Thomas's delight, Katherine watched them together, her son's rapt expression, Nate's animated gestures, and felt something shift inside her. Whatever the future held in Helena, she knew with sudden clarity that she did not want Nathaniel James to disappear from their lives. The realization kept her awake long after Thomas and Nate had fallen asleep. She lay in the wagon, listening to the night sounds and contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought this man into their lives just when they needed him most. By midday of the second day, they crested a rise that revealed Helena spread before them in the valley below. The mining town had grown substantially since Katherine had last seen it 3 years earlier, when she and Stuart had visited his brother. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and the streets appeared busy with activity. "Quite a sight," Nate remarked, reining his horse beside the wagon. "Town's booming." Katherine nodded, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. Their journey was ending, but uncertainty lay ahead. "James's ranch is about 5 miles northeast of town," she said, pointing toward distant pastures. "We should reach it before sunset." As they approached Helena, the trail widened into a proper road, and they began to pass other travelers' freight wagons, riders, and the occasional family in farm wagons. Katherine became acutely conscious of their appearance after weeks on the trail, smoothing her travel-worn dress and attempting to tidy her hair. "You look fine," Nate assured her, noticing her self-conscious adjustments. "Trail dust becomes you." His teasing compliment made her smile despite her nerves. "I'm sure James's wife Caroline will have other opinions. She's always impeccably presented." The Coleman ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. It was a prosperous spread with well-maintained buildings, fertile pastures, and a handsome 2-story house painted white with green trim. As they approached the main house, a tall man emerged onto the porch, shading his eyes against the setting sun. James Coleman shared his brother's height and coloring, but little else where Stuart had been lean and restless. James was solid and settled, his face weathered by years working his land. "Katherine," he called, recognizing her as they drew closer. His gaze moved from her to Thomas, then to Nate, his expression shifting from welcome to confusion. "Where's Stuart?" Katherine drew the wagon to a halt in the yard. Before she could respond, Caroline appeared in the doorway behind her husband, her surprise evident. "We weren't expecting you for another week at least," she said, her eyes taking in the same details her husband had noted. "And where is Stuart?" Katherine climbed down from the wagon, lifting Thomas after her. "It's a long story, James, Caroline." She turned to Nate, who had dismounted and stood respectfully to one side. "This is Nathaniel James. He's been our trail companion and protector. Without him, we might not have made it at all." James approached, extending his hand to Nate. "Any friend of Katherine's is welcome here," he said, though questions remained in his eyes. "Thank you for seeing my sister-in-law and nephew safely to us." Nate shook the offered hand. "It was my honor, sir. Mrs. Coleman and Thomas are fine traveling companions." Caroline, ever the proper hostess, recovered quickly from her surprise. "You must all be exhausted. Come inside. Supper's nearly ready and you can refresh yourselves while it's finished." As they entered the house, Katherine felt the sharp contrast between their weeks on the trail and the civilized comfort of the Coleman home. Polished furniture, curtained windows, and the aroma of a home-cooked meal reminded her of all they had left behind in Cheyenne. Caroline showed Katherine and Thomas to the guest room they would share, while James led Nate to the washroom off the kitchen. Left alone momentarily, Katherine sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by their arrival and the impending explanation she would need to provide. Thomas, however, showed no such hesitation. He bounced on the bed, excited by the new surroundings. "Uncle James has a big house. Will Mr. Nate stay too?" The innocent question struck Katherine's heart. "No, sweetheart. Mr. Nate has his own plans in Helena, but perhaps we'll see him again." Thomas's face fell. "But he belongs with us now." Katherine had no answer that would satisfy either her son or herself. Instead, she helped him wash and change into the cleanest clothes they had remaining after their journey. At supper, Katherine explained Stuart's abandonment as factually as possible, sparing James and Caroline the most painful details. James's face darkened with anger at his brother's actions, while Caroline reached across the table to squeeze Katherine's hand in sympathy. "You will stay here as long as you need," James assured her. "This is your home now." "I'm grateful," Katherine replied, "but I don't want to be a burden. I plan to establish myself in Helena eventually." "There's no rush," Caroline insisted. "Family takes care of family." Throughout the conversation, Nate remained quiet, listening respectfully. When James inquired about his plans, he explained his intention to view the land his cousin had recommended. "Good grazing in that area," James acknowledged. "If you're planning to raise horses, as Katherine mentioned, you've chosen well." As the evening progressed, Katherine observed the easy way James and Nate conversed, discussing land management, horse breeding, and the local economy. There was a mutual respect developing between the men that gave her an unexpected sense of hope. When the meal ended, James invited Nate to stay the night rather than return to town in darkness. "We've plenty of room, and you've had a long journey." Nate accepted the offer with gratitude, though Katherine noticed a certain tension in his shoulders as the evening wore on. When Thomas was put to bed, insisting on a good night from Mr. Nate, Katherine found a moment alone with him on the porch while James and Caroline cleared the supper dishes. "You seem troubled," she observed as they stood side by side, looking out at the stars emerging over the Montana landscape. Nate turned to her, his expression serious in the fading light. "I've been thinking about tomorrow," he admitted. "About saying goodbye." Katherine's heart quickened. "Is it goodbye, then?" "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want, Katherine." The directness of his response took her breath away. "What I want. These weeks on the trail, they've meant something to me." Nate's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "You and Thomas. You've come to matter to me a great deal." Katherine felt as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. "We've only known each other a short time." "Some things don't require years to recognize," Nate replied. "I knew the moment I saw you standing beside that broken wagon, rifle in hand, protecting your boy you were someone special." His words unlocked something Katherine had been holding tightly within herself, the growing affection, the sense of rightness she felt in his company, the way Thomas had flourished under his attention. "I don't know what the future holds," she said honestly. "I need to establish security for Thomas, to find my footing after Stuart's betrayal." Nate nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I wouldn't rush you, Katherine, but I would ask permission to call on you to see where time might lead us." The simple request, offered with such respect for her circumstances, touched Katherine deeply. "I would like that very much," she whispered. A smile broke across Nate's face, transforming his features in the moonlight. For a moment, Katherine thought he might reach for her hand, but the sound of the door opening behind them brought a swift end to their private conversation. "Fine night," James commented, joining them on the porch. "Montana shows its best face in spring." The moment had passed, but something had changed between Katherine and Nate, a silent understanding, a promise of possibilities. The following morning brought difficult goodbyes as Nate prepared to depart for his cousin's property. Thomas clung to him, refusing to accept that their daily companionship was ending. "Why can't you stay with us?" the boy demanded, his lower lip trembling. Nate knelt to Thomas's level. "I have to see about my own place, young man, but Helena's not so big that we won't see each other again." "Promise?" Thomas insisted with a child's demand for certainty. "I promise," Nate assured him, ruffling his hair, "and I keep my promises." The pointed difference between this vow and Stuart's abandoned commitments was not lost on Katherine. She stood nearby, her own goodbye caught in her throat. When Nate straightened and turned to her, James tactfully drew Thomas away, giving them a moment of privacy. "Thank you," Katherine said simply. "For everything." "I'll call on you in a week's time," Nate said, his voice carrying a question despite his earlier confidence. Katherine nodded. "I'll look forward to it." Nate mounted his horse, tipped his hat to James and Caroline, and with a final glance at Katherine and Thomas, rode toward his future. Katherine watched him go, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within her. Unlike Stuart's departure, which had left her bereft and abandoned, Nate's leaving carried the promise of return. It was not an ending but a pause, a necessary separation before their paths might converge again. The next days brought adjustment to life at the Coleman ranch. James insisted that Katherine take time to rest and recover from their journey before making any decisions about her future. Caroline, initially reserved, warmed considerably when she discovered Katherine's skill with needle and thread, bringing out mending that had accumulated over the winter. Thomas thrived in the open spaces of the ranch, following James around as he tended to chores and learning about the animals with enthusiastic curiosity. The boy spoke of Nate often, recounting their adventures on the trail and asking daily when they would see him again. 5 days after their arrival, a letter came from Stuart, forwarded from Cheyenne. James brought it to Katherine with a grim expression, clearly having recognized his brother's handwriting. Katherine read it alone in the guest room, her hands trembling slightly. Stuart wrote from Sacramento, his words brimming with excitement about the mining prospects he'd discovered. He asked about their journey to Helena, as if he hadn't abandoned them on the trail. The letter concluded with a vague promise to send for them once he'd struck it rich. The page crumpled in Katherine's hand. Once, such a letter would have left her torn between hope and despair. Now, she felt only a distant sadness for the man Stuart had become, and the family he had discarded. James found her on the porch later, staring out at the mountains. "Bad news?" he asked, nodding toward the crumpled letter in her lap. "Just Stuart being Stuart," she replied. "Making promises he won't keep." James sighed, settling into the chair beside her. "My brother was always chasing the horizon, even as a boy, never satisfied with what was in front of him." He glanced sideways at Katherine. "I hope you know you're better off without him." Katherine smiled faintly. "I'm beginning to understand that." "And Nathaniel James?" James asked carefully. "He seems a solid sort of man." "He is," Katherine agreed, her cheeks warming. "Very different from Stuart in many ways." James nodded thoughtfully. "Caroline and I have been talking. If you're serious about establishing yourself in Helena, there's a small cottage on the north edge of our property. It was built for our foreman, but he's since constructed his own place closer to town. With some work, it could be a proper home for you and Thomas." The offer took Katherine by surprise. "James, that's incredibly generous." "It's practical," he countered. "You'd have your independence. Thomas would still be close enough to spend time here when you're working, and Caroline would have your company, which she's come to appreciate." The idea appealed to Katherine, immediately a place of their own, yet with family nearby. "I would want to pay rent," she insisted. "Once I've established some dressmaking clients." James waved away her concern. "We'll work out the details. The important thing is that you and Thomas have a stable future here." The cottage, which they visited the next day, was small but solidly built, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy main room, and a kitchen with a proper stove. It stood near enough to the main house to be convenient but far enough for privacy, with a view of the mountains that took Katherine's breath away. "It needs some attention," James acknowledged as they toured the dusty interior. "Hasn't been lived in for nearly a year." "It's perfect," Katherine breathed, already envisioning curtains at the windows and a garden beside the front door. Thomas ran from room to room, claiming the smaller bedroom as his own. They spent the next 2 days cleaning and preparing the cottage. Caroline contributed linens and kitchenware, while James arranged for furniture to be delivered from town. Katherine worked tirelessly, scrubbing floors and washing windows, finding unexpected joy in creating a home that was truly hers. When the promised week had passed and Nate had not appeared, Katherine tried to hide her disappointment. She reminded herself that travel could be unpredictable, and that his business with his cousin might have taken longer than expected. On the 8th day after his departure, as Katherine hung laundry behind the cottage, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Turning, she saw Nate riding toward her, leading a pack-horse laden with supplies. He dismounted as she walked to meet him, his face breaking into a smile that matched her own. "I apologize for the delay," he said, removing his hat. The land was farther than expected, and there were papers to file in town. "You're here now," Katherine replied, suddenly shy despite the joy bubbling within her. "Would you like to see our new home?" Nate's expression brightened further. "You found a place already." Katherine explained James's generous offer as she led Nate toward the cottage. "It needs work still, but it's ours, mine and Thomas's." As they approached the small house, Thomas burst through the door, having heard Nate's arrival. "Mr. Nate, you came back," he cried, launching himself at the man. Nate caught him easily, swinging him up into his arms. "I promised I would, didn't I?" The tour of the cottage was cheerful and animated, with Thomas proudly showing Nate every corner of their new home and Katherine pointing out her plans for improvements. When they settled at the small table in the main room, Katherine served coffee from her new stove with pride. "It suits you," Nate observed, looking around the modest space that already reflected Katherine's touch. "A proper home." "And your land?" Katherine asked. "Did it meet your expectations?" Nate's eyes lit up as he described the property he had claimed: 160 acres of rolling grassland with a creek running through it, stands of pine for building, and enough open space for the horses he planned to raise. "It's about 5 miles from here," he explained. "Close enough to town for convenience, but far enough for peace." "You've secured it, then?" Nate nodded. "Filed my claim yesterday. Spent the last week surveying boundaries and planning where to build. My cousin Patrick's been a great help." As they talked, Katherine felt the same comfortable connection that had developed on the trail. Nate spoke of his plans with practical enthusiasm, including Thomas in the conversation and valuing Katherine's opinions in a way Stuart never had. When James and Caroline arrived to meet Nate, having spotted his horse from the main house, the gathering became an impromptu celebration of new beginnings. James and Nate discussed building techniques, while Caroline and Katherine planned a trip into Helena to purchase fabric for curtains and to introduce Katherine to potential dressmaking clients. As evening approached, Nate reluctantly prepared to leave. "I should return before dark. I'm camping on my property until I can build something more substantial." "You'll join us for Sunday dinner," Caroline invited, having warmed considerably to the young man. "I'd be honored," Nate accepted, his eyes finding Katherine's with unspoken meaning. In the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged. Nate worked on constructing a cabin on his land while Katherine established herself in Helena as a seamstress, taking in mending and eventually commissions for dresses from the town's growing population of merchants' wives. Nate called at the cottage regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts: a carved wooden bird for Thomas, wildflowers for Katherine, or game from his hunting. On Sundays, they shared dinner with James and Caroline, the connections between them all strengthening with each gathering. During this time, Katherine observed the deepening bond between Thomas and Nate. Her son, who had often struggled to hold his father's attention, flourished under Nate's genuine interest. They fished together in the creek that ran near the cottage, built a small corral for the pony James gifted Thomas, and spent hours identifying animal tracks in the surrounding woods. One evening in late summer, after Thomas had gone to bed exhausted from a day helping Nate set fence posts, Katherine and Nate sat on the cottage porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass as darkness fell. "My cabin's nearly finished," Nate said, his voice thoughtful. "Roof's on, floors laid. Windows arrive next week." "You've worked miracles in a short time," Katherine commented, genuinely impressed by what he'd accomplished in just 2 months. "Had good motivation," Nate replied, his gaze steady on her face. "Been thinking about the future." Katherine's heart quickened. Over the summer, their relationship had deepened, moving beyond friendship into something neither had explicitly named. Nate had been unfailingly respectful of her recent widowhood though Stuart lived. Their marriage was legally considered ended by his abandonment, and of her need to establish independence. "What are your thoughts on that future?" she asked softly. Nate shifted to face her more directly. "I think you know I've grown to care for you, Katherine, for Thomas too. These past months have been the happiest of my life." "They've been wonderful for us as well," Katherine admitted. "Thomas adores you." "And his mother?" Nate asked, his voice low. Katherine met his gaze in the fading light. "His mother finds herself thinking of you far more often than might be considered proper." A smile tugged at Nate's lips. "Propriety has its place, but so does honesty between two people who have shared what we have." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and sure. "I'm not a man for flowery speeches, Katherine, but I know what I want, and that's a life with you and Thomas if you'll have me." The directness of his proposal, so characteristic of the man himself, moved Katherine deeply. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Taking on another man's son, a woman who's still finding her way." "I've never been more certain of anything," Nate interrupted gently. "Thomas is a gift, not a burden, and you," he squeezed her hand, "you're the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known." "I don't want to rescue you, Katherine. I want to build something with you." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. Stuart had spoken of adventures they would have, fortunes they would seek. Nate spoke of building, of permanence, of shared creation. "I would like that very much," she whispered, "to build a life with you." Nate's face transformed with joy. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as Katherine responded, her hand rising to touch his cheek. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Nate rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak to James," he said. "Ask for his blessing as the head of your family now." Katherine laughed softly. "James has been expecting this conversation for weeks. Caroline too." "Observant folks," Nate chuckled. "Thomas will be overjoyed," Katherine said, thinking of her son's attachment to Nate. "He asked me just yesterday if you could be his new papa." Nate's expression grew serious. "I would consider that the greatest honor of my life, Katherine, to be a father to Thomas, a husband to you." They sat together as night fully descended, planning their shared future, a wedding before winter, combining their households in Nate's new cabin, expanding it over time as their family grew. "I never expected this," Katherine confessed, nestled against Nate's side. "When Stuart left us with that broken wagon, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was just beginning." "Sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best paths," Nate replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I thank God every day that I decided to check on that camp smoke I spotted across the prairie." The wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees had turned golden against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. It was a simple ceremony in the church in Helena, with James giving the bride away and Caroline standing as matron of honor. Thomas, dressed in his best suit, proudly carried the rings, his face solemn with the importance of his task until the moment he spotted Nate waiting at the altar, when his serious expression dissolved into an irrepressible grin. Katherine wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had sewn herself, with Caroline's help. As she walked down the aisle toward Nate, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment from abandonment on a lonely trail to the promise of a shared future. Nate's face as she approached him contained everything she had come to love about him: strength, kindness, and absolute certainty in his choice. When he took her hands in his touch steadied her as it had from the first day they met. The minister's words blended together in Katherine's memory afterward, but Nate's vows remained clear and true. "I promise to stand beside you in all seasons, to help shoulder your burdens and celebrate your joys, to be a father to Thomas and a faithful husband to you for all the days of our lives." Katherine's own vows, spoken through tears of happiness, affirmed her commitment to the life they would build together. When Nate slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small pearl that he had carried with him for years, Katherine felt the last pieces of her heart healing. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. Before he could complete the traditional instruction, Nate had drawn Katherine into his arms for a kiss that sealed their covenant and prompted cheers from the small gathering of friends and neighbors who had come to witness their union. The celebration afterward at James and Caroline's ranch was joyful and relaxed, with good food, music from local fiddlers, and dancing that continued until the stars emerged. Thomas, overwhelmed with excitement, fell asleep on a bench and was gently carried to bed by his new father. When Katherine and Nate finally departed for their home, his completed cabin that would now be theirs together, they rode side by side in the wagon that had once been broken beyond repair, but now carried them toward their future. "Happy, Mrs. James?" Nate asked as they approached the cabin, which glowed with welcoming lamplight, prepared earlier by Nate's cousin Patrick. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Katherine replied, leaning against his shoulder as Thomas slept between them, their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. The cabin expanded as Nate had promised, with additional rooms added as their family grew. The following spring brought the birth of their daughter, Emma, a robust child with her father's green eyes and her mother's determination. Katherine's dressmaking business flourished, with ladies from Helena and surrounding settlements seeking her skilled craftsmanship. Nate's horse breeding operation gained reputation throughout the territory for quality stock. Thomas, thriving under his stepfather's guidance, developed a natural affinity for horses that suggested he might follow in Nate's footsteps. 2 years after Emma's birth, their son William joined the family, completing their household with his curious nature and infectious laugh. The James Ranch, as it came to be known, became a gathering place for neighbors and travelers alike, known for its hospitality and the strong partnership of its owners. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting, Nate surprised Katherine with a gift: a new wagon, sturdier and more comfortable than the one that had broken on the trail. "For family journeys," he explained as she admired his handiwork. "Though I hope we never face the trials of that first one." "I wouldn't change it," Katherine said, wrapping her arms around his waist. "That broken axle brought you to us. Sometimes what seems like disaster is actually the beginning of something wonderful." Nate pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Best repair job I ever undertook," he murmured against her skin. "Fixed a wagon and found my heart's home all at once." As their children played nearby, Thomas, now 9 and confident, Emma curious and adventurous at 4, William toddling after his siblings at 2, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the moment of abandonment on that lonely Wyoming trail to this life of purpose and love, every step had led them home. "I love you, Nathaniel James," she said simply, raising her face to his. "And I love you, Katherine James," he replied, his kiss a renewal of the promise they had made beneath Montana's vast sky to build, to cherish, and to journey forward together, whatever trails lay ahead. The years continued to be kind to the James family. Their ranch prospered, expanding to include more grazing land for Nate's growing herd of horses. Katherine's dressmaking evolved into a small shop in Helena, where she employed 2 young women and developed a reputation that extended as far as Butte and Great Falls. Thomas, as he matured into a young man, showed not only his stepfather's gift with horses, but also a head for business. By 18, he was handling much of the ranch's horse trading, traveling to auctions and developing contacts throughout the territory. Emma inherited her mother's skill with needle and thread, but applied it to leatherwork, creating saddles and tack that complemented the family's horse breeding operation. Young William, with his quick mind, excelled in school and spoke of attending university in the East, a dream his parents fully supported. News of Stuart came infrequently and inconsistently over the years. He never returned to Montana, though occasional letters arrived from California, then Nevada, then Colorado, each describing a new opportunity, a fresh start, another chance at the fortune that always seemed just beyond his grasp. Katherine read these letters with a detached interest, sharing them with Nate and sometimes with Thomas, who maintained a distant curiosity about his biological father, but had long since given his heart to the man who had raised him. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the wide porch Nate had built just as he described on the trail, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson, Katherine reflected on the twists of fate that had shaped their lives. "I was thinking about that day," she said, her head resting on Nate's shoulder, "when Stuart rode away and left us with that broken wagon." "Darkest day of your life?" Nate asked, his arm tightening around her. Katherine shook her head, smiling up at him. "I thought so then. Now I know it was the day everything began to mend, not just the wagon, but my heart, my trust, our future." Nate's kiss was as tender as the first they had shared on her cottage porch all those years ago. "Some breaks can't be fixed," he said thoughtfully, "but they can lead to something stronger being built in their place." From inside the house came the sounds of their children, Emma playing the piano James and Caroline had gifted them, William reciting poetry he'd memorized for school, Thomas's deep laugh as he teased his siblings. The life they had built together surrounded them, solid and true as the mountains on the horizon. "I wouldn't change a moment of it," Katherine said, taking Nate's weathered hand in hers. "Not even the broken wagon." "Especially not the broken wagon," Nate agreed, his smile reflecting the certainty that had guided them from that first meeting on the Wyoming trail to this moment of quiet contentment beneath Montana's endless sky. "It led me home,"